Jonathan, it's great to see you today.
Fantastic to see you, Jason.
So, Jonathan, you have one of the largest pro-Ukrainian channels on YouTube, and you've been following the war very carefully. What have you been seeing recently? What are you hearing?
Of course, you have a lot of coverage of what's happening day by day. The minute changes in the front line, etc. A lot of material that people put out tend to focus on that, and of course, there's all sorts of endless speculation around that. We also find that the sort of psychodrama taking place in the White House, Trump's daily statements, which seem to contradict whatever he said the previous day. There's a huge amount of coverage on that, and people bring their own political biases, their own partisanship to that. People get into all sorts of fights, and even though they are nominally pro-Ukraine, we have a lot of people kind of screaming at each other, actually. I think part of that comes from not knowing what's really going on, not knowing what's going to happen next, not knowing if Trump is actually going to align with Ukraine or whether he's going to continue to act to the benefit of Russia. But a lot of this stuff is speculative. A lot of this is almost like criminology has come to Washington. We're parsing his every utterance. We're rooting through the kind of word salad or semantic soup to find amongst the sort of garbled phrases something we can latch onto. And everyone's doing that. What I try to do is try to put a bit more historical perspective on that through the conversations that I have.
That's a good point. Let's start with that. Give me some historical perspective. Now, Ukraine, we're both rooting for, obviously, but what happens next? Do you think that Russia at some point will just accept that they've lost this war? Or do you think that the Putin regime will not survive the war?
Russia has the capacity to accept and change and let things go. Putin, I think, does not. So that's kind of an interesting paradigm there. Russia may well change after losing the war catastrophically, but that has to happen before there's going to be any change whatsoever. Putin, however, from everything I've seen, he seems to have very few tools in his strategic armory. One is to double down and double down and double down again. Whenever in a corner, you accelerate into it. You double down, you increase the violence, you increase the threat. And we've seen this behavior throughout. And we've seen the West really respond to that rather than taking the strategic lead. And we've seen this constant fear of what that escalation, to use the parlance, might lead to. So that pattern of behavior, I think, is baked in here. It's just that we are moving in more and more extreme directions. I'm not going to sort of use the sort of whole nuclear thing there, but certainly in terms of conventional violence, Putin seems there's no real limit to where he'll go with that, and how many Russian resources, and by this I include the human resources, how much of that he's prepared to burn up. So a lot of the drama that we see is Ukraine telling us this is how it is, the West failing to listen, failing to act, and Putin behaving in what is a remarkably predictable fashion. The only way to break that cycle is to become unpredictable, to do things that Russia cannot predict. Or to massively escalate against them, give Ukraine everything it needs, and thereby push Russia out of the territory. That would be perceived as a catastrophic loss, and whatever happens next is very unpredictable. But certainly, Russia, I think, is capable of some geopolitical change, or at least an interesting conversation that hasn't gone on the channel yet. So I wouldn't call it change and reform because that's where people's minds will be going. But Russia is perfectly capable of doing retrenchment. At the end of the Cold War, it no longer had the economic military power and perhaps the will to hold on to Eastern Europe, to hold on to the Baltics and so on, and it let those go. It no longer had at that point the strength to dominate and control Central Asia. And it sort of let that slide for a number of years. So it is possible for Russia to look at things in I would say, almost a rationally comic way and say, well, do you know what? We cannot sustain this level of imperial aggression. So Russia, yes, capable of it. If Prigozhin had made it to the Kremlin, he may well have entered a period of retrenchment, imperial retrenchment, while he built up his internal power base. And I think for those who say, oh, but who follows Putin is going to be worse, they're missing the point of this. Whoever follows Putin will have a number of years where he or she, very likely to be a she, but where he would have to consolidate that internal power and would not necessarily be looking beyond Russia's borders, at least for a number of years.
No, I fully agree with you. I think that a lot of people would say that someone only worse than Putin will have to come to power. It doesn't look at history. The fact is, the counter-revolutionary phase is the most dangerous part of any revolution. So consolidating power needs to be your top priority. Having soldiers in Moscow to protect you and your new regime, which isn't legitimate most likely, is very, very important. More important than making sure that Georgia, the Caucasus, or Central Asia, or Ukraine are under wraps. More important is how do I protect my own self and my own future to build my new dynasty? But looking ahead, what else do you think would happen? How do you think something like the Putin regime could come to an end?
There's also, of course, one of the big fears, and one of the big fears that is controlling Western action, preventing it from supplying Ukraine with whatever has been needed over these last 3 years, is not just the idea of nuclear escalation, it's the idea of nuclear chaos. It's the idea of a fragmented Russia, breaking up into multiple statelets that are barely governable, run by warlords who are nuclear armed warlords. It's amazing where the mind of the Western bureaucrat and analyst can go with this. I don't think these scenarios are in any way likely. But even if we were to see some kind of radical fragmentation of Russia, I think it would be in some ways easier to deal with those statelets. They would be desperate for trade. They'd be desperate for their own security. They may well be looking for external alliances to help guarantee these new borders. So I think we impose upon future scenarios for Russia a sort of catastrophic nightmare, I would say, of our own imaginings. But ironically, the sort of GRU want us to believe that as well, because they don't want us to supply Ukraine to make that scenario more likely. So we are in some ways being coercively manipulated and controlled into making these nightmares real. But one of the interesting conversations I had, and this was a fantastic chap at the Lviv Media Forum, was Valery Pekar, and he's a Ukrainian entrepreneur, and he is thinking what for many Western policymakers is the unthinkable. Not only what happens to Russia in that scenario, but what kind of Russia do we want to see? And how can we expedite a route towards that? And he's trying to imagine scenarios that aren't necessarily sort of catastrophic doom and gloom scenarios. But I think this sort of discussion, this kind of realistic thinking is incredibly important. And again, if we go the other way and we look at some of the sort of so-called opposition, they really put emphasis on Russia breaking up into along the lines of ethnicity, along the lines of, Buryatia and so on, all these multiplicity of different ethnic groups that have been genocided throughout history and suppressed by Russia. Unfortunately, they were subsumed into Russia before they became nation states. There's not an awful lot to build on there, and there's not an awful lot in the way of democratic sort of culture and history. So I think the better example would be to say we have to make the fragmentation of Russia as attractive to ethnic Russians as it is to the other ethnicities. And in many of these sort of so-called republics that may form breakaway parts, well, Russians aren't necessarily the minority in all of them. So we have to have a vision that is attractive for ethnic Russians. At this point, however, it is the sort of imperial narratives, it is the historical mythologies, it is the narrative version of history created by Moscow to control its populace. That is the one that's being told. That is one that's being communicated. We are not putting forward any alternative vision, let alone using any kind of, black propaganda behind it. We're not putting forward any, I would say, sort of, clean propaganda or alternative narratives for ethnic Russians to latch onto. And that's a shame, because I think we should be engaging this. We should be imaginatively thinking about what kind of future Russia we see, because there will not be peace, prosperity, and security in Eastern Europe, or indeed in Central Europe, until the Russia question is resolved.
Absolutely. So a lot of times we talk about the war and when it ends, but what will prevent Russia from not coming across those borders ever again? What will stop them? It's only if there's a decision on the side of Russia to no longer invade. And that's something that can only happen if Russia's nationalism, which is truly a sickness, is finally stomped out.
That's it.
But what else have you heard recently? What are people telling you? You do a lot of interviews, you talk to people from around the world. What are they saying currently about the war or Russia post-war?
Well, there's a topic which I know you are interested in. It does get some traction, and that is the impending economic collapse of Russia. I say that without saying that it's guaranteed or putting any time frame on it, because this is an interesting topic. I mean, it really does get a lot of traction, but it's also easy to clickbait it. You know, Russia's collapsing, doom, gloom, the economy is over. Unfortunately, Russia is transitioning pretty rapidly to a Soviet-style command economy. And in fact, it's being consumed as a military economy. Yes, it's consuming its national resource and wealth. It's consuming its people. It's not producing, economically productive output as everything is getting subsumed into that. And it's burning up all the features of a market economy in order to do it. The challenge is that, yes, the market economy is close to complete collapse. The market economy that was constructed in the 90s is close to being snuffed out. What we don't know is how long Russia can exist as a brutal command economy driven by a militaristic imperative. I'm not sure many economists know that either. Certainly, in that process, Russia will be turned into more of a gulag. I mean, there's no question of that, and more of its resource will be incinerated to power the war machine. But we don't know how long that can last, whether it's through this year or through next year or through the year after, and also, to an extent, that will depend on Western actions. The big story that I've been focusing on over the last couple of weeks is the frozen Russian assets. Now, if those are taken, if Western countries close the loopholes on Russian banks and the trading of LNG and oil and all this kind of stuff, if we close all those economic loopholes and starve the Russian economy of resource, if we close down the grey fleet in a really decisive manner, and if the oil price cap is to be reduced, as is being requested, to $45, then Putin's economy is in serious trouble, including the command economy, the militarized economy. If we really were to enforce secondary sanctions around the world and use that as a rational economic lever, then I think we would see Russia started the resource it needs to keep this war going, and it would have to face retrenchment. It would have to face that. And if Putin doesn't face that, then I expect there may be some sort of reckoning, and perhaps somebody who is prepared to face that reality. But at the moment, Putin's surviving because we're not closing the loopholes. We're not creating that pressured environment. And there are many sort of mini-garks and so on, and entrepreneurs in Russia who are benefiting from the current situation, which we're allowing to continue. And this is where all this fluff about Trump, he's used some harsh words about Putin in the last couple of days. And of course, the media instantly fixates onto that. Well, look at this. Trump has turned on Putin. Wow, it's all change. You have to look at the actions. And the actions currently, the number one thing that Trump could do to really screw Putin over is to agree to lowering that oil price cap and put pressure on the Europeans to shut down the grey fleet. So basically, he could tackle the whole hydrocarbon market if he was minded to. What are his actual actions? He's blocking that decision. He's preventing the Europeans who are now begging for this to happen. He's preventing any change in the oil price cap. That is the number one thing he could do at this point to benefit Putin. And that's what he's doing. That's his actual actions at this point. And for those who are going to sort of scream blue murder, how can I be so mean about, the cult leader? We have to look at his actions, not at the words. Putin isn't hurt by his words. Putin knows that these words are something of a smokescreen, and he's not going to care one jot about what Trump says about Putin. He's going to look at whether he's taking any action to choke off the Russian economy, and he's not.
Absolutely the case. So let's look ahead, though. Let's imagine that the US Senate, which already has found 81 co-sponsors for the new set of sanctions, gets passed. And that gets through, and sure enough, it'll put 500% tariffs on all goods coming from countries that buy Russian gas or buys Russian oil, uranium, and a host of other things. Now, obviously, it's China and India who'd be most affected by that. They buy combined about 85% of all of Russia's oil. Now, Russia's oil obviously is very important for the Russian economy, given that it makes up about 38% of the national budget of Russia. Now, do you think it's realistic that the US would slap 500% tariffs on goods coming from China or India? And do you think that China and India will play ball, or they'll try to play a game of chicken with the Americans?
I think in the context of what we've seen over the last couple of months, unfortunately, we've seen that this is a game of cry wolf. Tariffs are imposed, tariffs are threatened, tariffs are withdrawn. We see extraordinary amount of flip-flopping and uncertainty. And on this basis, those tariffs may or may not be imposed. I'm minded to think they probably won't be imposed. But if they were to be imposed, I think countries will be looking at this and going, well, hang on a second. You were talking about this kind of scale of tariffs before anyway, not in the context of Russia. And it seems that you're placing these tariffs on your allies rather than your enemies, harder than on your supposed adversaries. I think now such a move would be lost. The message should be lost in the general chaos of tariffs and flip-flopping. That move might actually drive countries closer to this alternative economic ecosystem, the dark or grey economy of autocracies. I think it needs to be far more targeted and it needs to be made specific. But unfortunately, a certain amount of credibility has been lost over the last couple of months. And of course, such a move would bounce back to hurt American consumers so badly that that would risk the entire effort to try and thwart Russia.
So recently you were in Lviv. What'd you see there? What's happening? What'd you hear?
So this is absolutely sort of fascinating because there are some great conversations, some of which have not yet been published. And on the one hand, you've got Valery Pekar, who I mentioned, who is really talking and thinking about decolonization of Russia and what comes next. Absolutely extraordinary. We had Elena Khrazdan, who's a Ukrainian economist. Again, a much more realistic assessment of the Russian economy and leaning to the idea that it's not going to sort of instantaneously collapse. We need to arm Ukraine and prepare for the Russian economy holding out much longer. We have sort of extraordinary journalists and analysts like Angelina Karyakiana and many others. And one that really sort of struck me was Katerina Zaremba. So, she's a Ukrainian intellectual, translator, one of the sort of, I would say, literary elite of Ukraine, but joined a Hospitalia battalion at the start of the war. And it just shows that, Russia is sending its worst people to fight, and Ukraine is sending its best. Many of its best have already passed, but there are still many extraordinary people who are there defending it. And I think that, that doesn't come across strongly enough. But when you actually talk to people who are doing this, who are making that sacrifice, you have not only families but have extraordinary contribution to make to the cultural life of their country, but are there on the front lines taking these extraordinary risks. I think that really strikes you. Something else, but I won't name names here. The other impression I got is that there's a lot of West-Splaining, I think. I've just put an episode up on the channel where I talk at length about this. But this is West-Splaining, where people come in and they're highly sympathetic to Ukraine, but they overlay their own sort of Western frameworks, their own Western ideas onto Ukraine. And sometimes that can be not only extraordinarily inaccurate, but extraordinarily offensive, even though they don't mean it to be. And when we overlay these kind of ideas on Russia, when we make sort of certain assumptions that ultimately they're going to think and act and behave like we are, and that their geopolitics is going to follow some kind of rationality eventually, then I think we're taking extremely, extremely dangerous steps there. Because, I mean, you and I will almost certainly agree that Russia does not follow that Western pattern and template. And indeed, it comes from a completely different origins in terms of its civilization, if you might want to call it that way, or how its political mechanisms are involved. completely different from sort of Western thought processes, perspectives, and aspirations. And unfortunately, even though there are people who have covered the war extensively and are, I would say, extremely pro-Ukrainian, you still do get hints of this West-Splaining. You still do get hints of a complete miscomprehension when trying to interpret Russia, its motivations, and its future actions.
Absolutely the case. Jonathan, it was great talking with you today.
It's fantastic. Thank you, Jason.